As we come out of an election season defined by division and discord, now more than ever, it is critical that we hear from people who are level headed, informed on the issues, and who offer practical insights on the road ahead. I would argue that beyond COVID 19 and the uncertainty associated with our changing society, the key issue of our times is education. Who determines the priorities in education, whether the opportunities are equitably distributed, and what changes are needed in our current system to meet the needs of the community are key questions that our society must wrestle with. My name is Olaide Banks, and this is RETHINK.
I had the wonderful privilege to have as my guest the dynamic duo of Malene Dixon and Shani Dowell to help us understand where we are and where we're headed in this critical area of education policy and impact. Malene and Shani are sisters who grew up here in the city of Houston, attended public schools in Houston, attended top HBCUs, earned MBAs from prestigious universities, and now separately bring their skills and expertise to the field of education. Welcome, Malene. Welcome, Shani. It's great to have you with me today to have this crucial and critical conversation. How are you doing?
We're good. Thanks for having us.
Thanks for having us.
This is one of the first real conversations that I'm having since America elected a new president. And given your background, I think your voices are so valuable in this moment. You first, Malene, then you, Shani. What does the election of Joe Biden as president and Kamala Harris as vice president mean to you as an African American woman and the mother of a teenage girl?
Joe Biden and Kamala Harris is winning. Really, I saw a post on Facebook that rings true. That made parenting easier today because I was trying to figure out how will I explain how someone so opposite of everything that seems good in the world won as president again. Just thinking through what would happen if Trump won. So I'm just glad I don't have to have that conversation and I can have the opposite conversation about what is good in the world and how good prevails. And if you're just patient and if you work really hard and trust in people, which is something that we've had a lot of distrust in people, but being able to teach my children that we can trust in people and trust each other. And for my daughter in particular, just watching her soak up all of the awesomeness that is Kamala Harris is just really made a sigh of relief, a sigh of just prayers. It feels really good.
There's never been a black woman elected as governor, and there's only ever been 2 black women elected to the U.S. Senate. Still, the critical role of black women in the success of the Democratic Party goes back several decades. It seems like Stacey Abrams' strong show in the race for governor of Georgia in 2018 marked a turning point. Shani reflects on the importance of Kamala Harris.
Yeah, I would agree with that. So I have a 10-year-old daughter and a 7-year-old son, and they were very invested in this election. And I'm also a proud, as you mentioned, Howard alumnus. So, of course, Kamala Harris's alma mater. And it just, I think it says so much for women about the freedom to be ambitious. I think, if anything, sometimes some of the flack that Kamala got was for her ambition, but I think that it speaks to the opportunity for women to, go for what go for broke. I've read something that talked about Joe Biden, and I think kind of his example of one being the vice president under the first black president, and then for him to explicitly say, I'm going to choose a female vice president and then choose a black female vice president. I just think that speaks to white people and, what it truly means to be an ally. Joe Biden, we know he says crazy things sometimes. He is an imperfect person, but at times where it has mattered most, he has been an ally, and he's going to be our oldest president that we've ever selected. So that means how old he was when he was Barack Obama's vice president, and willing to go there and never, try to kind of, grandstand him. And then also that he chose Kamala when she was being her full authentic self. Kamala kind of took him when he was at his low point in the campaign. It was when she kind of raked him over the coals in some of the debates, and she was being her full and powerful and authentic self. And in that moment, you would think like, oh, she should have been quieter or kind of been playing the calculus to know if she could, but she didn't. She was her full authentic self, and that landed her and one of the highest offices in the land. And so I think that just speaks again to the power of authenticity and being yourself. And also I do, you talked about this, the power of Black women. I think there's so much for us to learn and be proud of as Black women in this country. And the only other thing I wanted to add is to what Malene was sharing is, and I was thinking about this and thinking about this podcast, is we have two people who at least at some level care about humans. And I think it's been, to have 4 years of our highest leaders not demonstrating a care for people outside of themselves. I think that takes a toll. And I think that's what we saw in the kind of collective relief that we saw yesterday, was people finally being like, oh, it's okay to care about people again. So excited about that also.
Yeah. So you both started your careers in corporate America, in consulting, but you found your way back to, I don't want to put words in your mouth, but what seems to be your passion in education and supporting the education process. Starting with you, Shani, and then you, Malene. When did you know that working in this education space was your calling, or was something that you were really passionate about? And how challenging was the process of moving from a corporate environment to the educational space for you?
So I first got my hint when I was working in consulting in Boston. And the company I worked for had like a mentorship program where I was working with students on the mock trial team. That's part of kind of like just community service. But I found myself so much more drawn to the impact and the work that I was doing with students. And so left consulting a year into it to work at a nonprofit. But then I always thought I would do youth serving organizations and not education, because education is very complex, very controversial. So it was when I ended up kind of through a path, ended up working at KIPP, which is a national network of nonprofit charter schools. And I went into schools that were serving predominantly Black and Latino students, and I saw them serving students really well. And it just convicted me, because I was like, I knew education could be different. Like I knew that we could have Black kids in school successful and joyful and learning. And that just convicted me when I was working at KIPP. And that really is what transformed my path kind of forevermore into education. Just when there can be a better way, it just kind of lights a fire in you to try to keep working towards a better way. That was helping school leaders get their school started. So it had kind of more of this business aspect to it, which I think for my parents really helped kind of like, that was easier to absorb than when I decided I wanted to go into the classroom and be a teacher. And that was when I think they were like, what's happening now? You have an MBA, you like have all this work experience, and you're in your late 20s. Like this is typically when people are transitioning out of a teaching career, not into a teaching career. But for me, it really wasn't hard at that point, because I've always been a person who, for better or for worse, make decisions based on passion and desire and impact. And so I knew my parents would eventually support the path, but they just had to, they came up with their own narrative of what I was doing and why, which I let them make peace with. But for me, it wasn't so hard. But financially, it was hard. Like I definitely had to like get used to telling friends I can't go out to eat at that restaurant. And, like I don't have the same, financial kind of setting that I used to have. But other than that, it really wasn't hard for me.
Shani mentioned that she attended and graduated from Howard University in Washington, D.C., the alma mater of Kamala Harris. Malene actually attended Spelman College in Atlanta, Georgia, the state that turned blue for the first time in 3 decades and gave Joe Biden a victory.
That was my first job out of college, was Enron, yes. And while I was at Enron, I don't know if you know the Junior Achievement Program. I was a Junior Achievement volunteer. So I went back to, first I did it in my high school once a week to teach economic class through Junior Achievement. I did a year at my high school, at Lamar High School, and I did a year at Yates High School. I loved working at Yates so much. Like the students, Lamar, even though it's my alma mater, they could care less if I was there. Like they looked bored, they were not engaged. Yates students were like literally sitting on the edge of their seats waiting for me to come talk to them. And I felt like I could stay there all day. Like I really felt at home just being with this group of students. It never occurred to me wow, whatever is that, almost 20, no, shoot, more, almost 20 years later, I think that I would be in the educational system. It never occurred to me. What that Junior Achievement did, though, was help me kind of just confirm that I wanted to do something that was community oriented. So when I went back to business school, So yeah, that was all that was Enron. Then I went back to business school, but I wanted to do more real estate development. I thought I did, but my heart kept being pulled to education. So while I was in Boston after business school, I ended up working for an after school education program, a tutoring program. Shani forgot that. I can see Shani's like, yeah, she did do that. Yeah, so I was working still like business oriented because I was in development. But then from there, I went to DIR. And so there was like the slow transition was taking place from corporate to nonprofit to DIR. It's like a mixture of, government, public, private.
DIR stands for Decision Information Resources Inc., a social policy research and evaluation firm headquartered in Houston and operating throughout the U.S. Malene talks about her relationship with DIR.
Still not really sure what I wanted to do, how I was going to pull my business degree together with my interest in community work. My father, or our father, is the owner of DIR, and we pretty much just talked our way into a position and said, we'll just see how this works for you, see how it fits for you, see what you enjoy doing while I was with DIR. And it was literally like a trial basis. Let's just see what happens because it might not work out. Well, I ended up staying at DIR for 8 years. I loved everything about DIR except I felt like there was so much more out there so there were a couple of programs that I worked on. And again, they were education and youth development. Those were the ones where I felt most connected. And what I enjoyed doing most was going out into doing these site visits, interviewing people, and just spending time talking to them. The biggest critique I got was stop trying to make recommendations. You're just supposed to be reporting what you see, like you're observing and reporting on what you're observing. I'm like, but I can help. I can, there's more that I can do. I don't want to just write down, then go back and then write this report about what I see, especially what I see is wrong. We should be doing something to help.
Yeah.
So that is what happened. That's what I started observing. I was like, I want to spend more time talking to the people, talking to the people. So I went to school to get another degree because who doesn't want another degree, right? So, yeah, I decided to go back and get a master's of education in counseling so that I could do more of the talking and engaging. And because Shani worked for KIP, I was looking for ways to be a. I was not looking to be a school counselor. This is God ordained this. I was not looking to be a school counselor because most school counselors you have to have 2 years of teaching experience. I knew my calling was not to be a teacher. I wanted to counsel. But KIP, because it is a charter school, I did not have to have the 2 years of teaching experience first in order to be a counselor. So just talking to Shani and her husband Randy over Christmas, the year that I was about to graduate from school, I found out then like, oh, so I could actually work for KIP and not have to teach for 2 years. Great. So that is how I ended up in education. Um, in hindsight, I think God was definitely ordering my steps the whole time. I just had no idea.
After Malene shared the story of her indirect path to a career in education, Shani spoke about her company, POSIP, and its ties to the field of education.
Yeah, so POSIP in our original kind of conception is really to help create a bridge between families and staff and the schools where their kids are or where they teach. And we do that through a routine text message based pulse check surveys. And so it's really just to make it super easy and to remove any barriers for parents in particular, but then also for staff members to share their feedback with their child's school. So that's kind of the original product and what we're doing. And where we see ourselves going is really to become the place where school leaders, educators, and parents go to make their kids and their schools stronger. Because what happens when we hear from parents and families and staff is we hear what's going well in schools, what's not going well, and we can start to what you were saying, Melina. We have a desire to not just observe what's happening, but also to be helpful. And so we create a lot of content on our website and content for our customers to try to help kind of figure out what the challenges are and to solve them. And you talked about this kind of election season, but in many ways, the election is just a reflection of our country. And unfortunately, we've gotten to a place in our country and potentially globally where it's very hard for people to hear each other. And so part of what we want to do is to create a space where schools can hear from families, but then also to help over time, help schools also communicate back with families so that families can hear from schools as well. So that's a little bit about what we do. I founded it based on my experiences as a teacher, as a person who's worked with a lot of principals, and then as a mother as well. And those were all the lenses that kind of made me realize there are a lot of gaps between parents in schools in particular. And one of the biggest ones is that we don't have systematic ways for schools to listen and hear from families. Yeah, we're actually almost intentionally not an app. So it's just a text message that parents get. So when we partner with either schools or districts, once we are partnered with a school or district, their families, we put their information into our system, just their phone numbers, emails, preferred language. And so the parents don't have to download anything. That's one of the things that actually ends up being helpful, because it's for a number of parents. One, we've seen the technology divide. We know a lot of families actually don't have steady Wi-Fi access, or they don't have smartphones. And so to not have to download an app or be online, they just get a text prompt. We first prompt them to respond to a quantitative question. The school can add their own question if they want. And if not, then we really leave it open-ended for parents to share either praise or feedback. That goes into our platform, so it is a technology. And then we have some automated bucketing to create the reports, along with the humans who also do some additional work on the reports. And then that gives schools go onto the website. They have like a web-based platform that they go into to see their record of reports, and so that then they can follow up from there.
Wow. So we'll talk a little bit more about that, because I have some questions in terms of, how you worked through COVID. But Malene, you recently presented a webinar that I had a chance to check out. I'd like for you to talk about that a little bit, because it really, I think it really touched on something that a lot of us were experiencing, especially during this time when we are, quote unquote, trapped in the house. We don't have all these distractions, and we have to kind of think about where we are and how things are affecting us. Tell us, can I call in racism? So is it like, can I call off of work for racism? Tell me about that. Tell me about that webinar, how that came about, and what was it about?
Yeah, so I also counsel. I'm a therapist for BetterHelp, which is virtual online telephone therapy organization. So BetterHelp, thankfully, is very socially conscious, and they were seeking, because this was around the time of George Floyd, so they sought out their Black therapists to see if anyone was interested in presenting a webinar about something that all of the racial injustices that were taking place. So it was initially for BetterHelp, and BetterHelp immediately loved it.
Yes. Who were you counseling? I mean, so you said BetterHelp provides. Is it for people in corporate America? Is it for schools, or?
It's a private organization that anyone can. I mean, it's like it's a subscription service. So
Okay.
the clients are literally from all over the world. I have clients all over the world. So the BetterHelp clients also, as part of their subscription service, have access to these webinars. There's a laundry list of webinars that BetterHelp therapists put on. So BetterHelp asked if I was open to, because it was such a needed conversation that I was having with the webinar, if I was interested in taking it off of BetterHelp for a larger audience. So for the first time ever, they had it live on YouTube. BetterHelp had never done that with their webinars before either, but they knew it was something that was needed and critical. So I appreciate BetterHelp for helping with that.
In 2020, the issue of mental health has come into sharp focus. The effects of a worldwide pandemic and the high-profile killings of African Americans has contributed to what some describe as a mental health crisis. Malene discusses.
So I was actually talking to one of my good friends in Arizona one day, and her husband is an attorney, and he was representing someone as one of the cases of a Black man who was killed by it wasn't a state trooper, DPS. I mean, it was like text dot, it was something like that. And he got killed, and no one saw anything. No one was around, and her husband's representing him. And so we were just talking about, it's like just nonstop hearing of our people getting killed needlessly. And she said, I'm just so sick of this. I just want to call in racism. And I said, that is me too. Like, can we do that? So it started out kind of as a joke out of, I mean, what else? We find ourselves often joking, because the stuff that is happening is so painful that if we want to survive this, we have to find some kind of humor in this. So it started out as a joke. But the more and more that we started talking to people, if any Black person is honest and aware of what's going on, at some point since COVID hit, we wanted to say, I don't have the mental or emotional capacity to talk to anyone about anything else that is not directly related to my well-being, the well-being of our people. So that's how the title came up.
Okay. And what was the response like to it? What was some of the feedback that you got from people who participated?
Overwhelmingly great feedback because the webinar starts with really defining ourselves and talking through just systemic racism in our country and colorism in the world and the impact that all the years of racism has on our mental health. And that's something that I saw with COVID. For the first time ever, I started seeing all of these commercials and news segments for the mental health crisis that was taking place, and then more particularly for Black people and our mental health. And like commercials for the Calm app all of a sudden are out there.
Yeah.
That did not happen before. So it's our people are hurting. I mean, people are hurting, period, but especially people of color are hurting. So the whole premise was, can I call in racism strategies to cope when racism is affecting your mental health? So I do end it on the positive of these are things, these are steps that you can take to help with the racism and the impact of racism that is having on your mental health.
Malene talks about how some African Americans are finding the courage to speak on this issue that for a long time has been taboo.
She just like this whole COVID quarantining situation was taking a toll on her, and it was 6 people. We were socially distant outside, but 6 people, men and women. And she said, I thought I was about to have to go see a therapist because I was just not in a good mental space. And for, just that statement alone, for her to feel comfortable enough to say it, that speaks volumes of where we are coming, uh, Black people in mental health, because often we don't talk about it. We're certainly not going to admit it to mixed company that we might need therapy.
Yeah. Yeah.
Shani spoke about how the COVID-19 pandemic has impacted her business and the work that her company does in the field of education.
Yeah, I mean, what's been interesting is it's had a tremendously positive impact on our business. And part of why I believe that is because whereas before, I think schools and districts were clear, like hearing from family engagement is something like diversity. Like everyone's going to say, oh, yes, we believe in it. It's important to do. But like the willingness to actually invest in it in significant ways is limited. And so I think that's kind of where we were as a company and as a country before COVID hit, which is like, yes, we want to hear from our parents, but really like it would be hard for schools or districts to really take the proactive efforts. The ones who did were ones who like really deeply were invested in it and believed in it. But then once COVID hit, schools and districts really literally didn't have a systematic way to hear from their families. So they didn't know what their technology needs were, school needs were. Are you coming to virtual school? Are you not coming to virtual school? And then the other thing that I think really happened once, this started to come down to decisions about, are we going to reopen school or not? Are we going to have in-person school or not? There were real differences around what people thought based on race and socioeconomic differences. And what had happened was the people who were speaking on behalf of everyone tended to be white, more affluent families, where they were saying what they were saying was, well, we need to reopen because the highest need families, they need to be back in school. And that is a true statement. Like everyone needs to be back in school. But how they were articulating their desire and the need to reopen was around the urgency for families who, maybe didn't have a college educated person at home. What was missing from that was the voices of people who would be directly affected by those decisions, predominantly Black and Latino folks. And what we ended up being able to do pulse checks and then kind of reach out to families for some districts when they were trying to make that reopening decision is Black and Latino families disproportionately did not want to return to in-person school because they also were at the intersection of systematic injustices on the healthcare side as well as on the educational side. But what they were saying, which is, a very rational thought, which is a hierarchy of needs, which is I can't get an education if I'm not alive. And so I need to be alive first. And what was really interesting about that is to be, as a company, we were able to see the types of things families shared. And there's always this assumption that, there are a lot of really interesting kind of intersections of race and class. But what was also interesting, and actually one of our partners, she really highlighted this and articulated this in a good way for me. She's like, she's a Black woman who works with a partner, and she said these people don't realize, like these kind of like education thought leaders, when they're like, oh, these kids can't be at home. What you're saying is I can't trust them to be with their people who raised them. And so, and you are disproportionately saying that about Black and Latino kids. So, what are you saying that you think about their families, where you talk about them like they can't even, like their families aren't going to do what's best for them or try their best? And we know that, there are a lot of real issues and challenges that families have and that people are having right now. And just for anybody, even the most privileged person, COVID-19 in 2020 is a lot to try to navigate. But there's also a sense that we need to like listen to all families and make decisions that don't just consider the needs of, affluent two-parent households who, are making decisions for everyone. So I went all over the place with your quick question.
Shani's response led us to an important point in our conversation: the issue of who is driving the discussion on education policy and who is missing from that conversation. I put that question to Malene. Here's her response.
Well, exactly what Shani said. The kids, like the students who are being impacted the most directly, are missing from this conversation. As a counselor, I get I get text messages and emails and phone calls from students who are at their wits' ends with, just how school is right now. And without saying a student's name, literally, this is a text from a student at 11 o'clock on Friday night. Now, I didn't respond because that was too late after hours, but I just want to know why the teachers give us so much work. It's stressful trying to finish so many assignments. Classes are already 80 minutes long. I feel like I'm not learning anything. Everything is just everywhere, honestly. I try to log in, but at this point, I'm tired of not learning anything. It's so much work. I barely understand anything. I spend like 30 minutes looking at the questions. Like, this is what's really happening with our students. And while we at our school might be able to listen, when Texas Education Agency is who we still have to report to.
Okay.
Texas Education Agency is not asking our students how they're handling this and how they're feeling. And so that's who's missing from the table.
Okay, so it's coming to you as a counselor. How does that then filter up through administration at the school level, then at the district level, and then at the TA level? I mean, are there real avenues and channels for getting that data back?
Shani then explained how her company, POSIP, helps to get parents, teachers, and administrators connected and communicating.
Well, what's interesting is we do have some of our partners where they do staff pulse checks and family pulse checks. And what was interesting about that, and this is, I think, the same thing with students, is you would make the assumption, and this is part of why communication is so important. You would assume like parents and staff are on different pages, but what you actually see when you pulse check both of them is they're saying some similar things. So, for example, we had a partner where the families were saying, hey, I know like the school was trying to create like a full day of schedule because they're like, well, we know families are trying to work and we know they have like kindergartners and first graders. So we're going to do a whole day of virtual learning from 8 to 3. And then the school's mind are like, this is the right thing to do because, parents must want their child to be occupied all day. Meanwhile, teachers are stressed out about it. But then families are like, I don't want my 5-year-old sitting on a Zoom call from 8 to 3. But without any way for them to both articulate that, they both think they're doing the other a favor. So the families are thinking, I guess the school wants my kids to sit on class from 8 to 3. The teachers are thinking, I guess the families want us to have their kids on Zoom from 8 to 3.
Right.
But then, so that I think to that point, like similarly, like if you gave away for the counselors even to say like, here's what I'm hearing from my students, like even if we don't have like great systems to like hear directly from students, at least create a path for the people who are teaching the students or the families who are working with the students to then be able to elevate that back up. But, unfortunately, and I was thinking about this again with the kind of election, like so few people who are in positions of power even send their kids to public school.
So I teach in a public charter school. I have one child. My daughter is at a public middle school. And then my son is at a private high school. The private high school is predominantly white. They have about 90% of their students back in person learning. My son is not one of those. A lot of the Black and Latino kids are not in person, but their school is expecting them to be back, and they think that parents are doing a disservice by keeping our kids home. Well, I'm not sending my child to school to get COVID because they send home at least once a week. We get an email from the school about a child testing positive for COVID. I do believe the school is doing everything they can do. I think it's very safe at school. However, it's still there. But so that's like 90% of their kids are back in person. At my school that is predominantly Black and Hispanic, we only have about 22% of our kids back in person. They were all 100% were given an option, but like to your point, Shani, they're not setting their kids up like that, and the kids are honestly afraid to come back too. We're doing everything. We're very safe and sanitized and all that, but the reality is, if you're looking at the private schools now, 90% the affluent, they have all the resources at their fingertips.
Malene expresses the fear that many in education have for our lower income students.
Then we're going to get left behind even further. The disparity, the gap is just growing.
But that's what privilege is, which is like you don't have to think about all those things. And I think, so I think if people who are in decision making, what they keep trying to do is just like make the decision and absent of like context. So they keep just saying like, we need to get kids back in school. Parents shared feedback that once I was like, yeah, that's real. They're like, this school can't even keep soap in, the bathrooms on a good day. And now y'all going to talk about y'all going to be like the bastion of sanitation and health. And I was like, good, having taught I'm like, good point. Like, you're right. Like,
yeah.
I know that as a teacher, you go to the bathroom, there's no soap in there. And so now all of a sudden, how are you going to convince parents that you can keep it, in tip-top sanitary shape? At the same time, what you're saying, Malene, we have to figure out a way so that kids can be back in learning. And I think we could come to some good solutions. But back to your original question, Olaide, who's at the table? The challenge is they don't bring folks to the table who could really honestly have the conversation. So they don't come up with good creative solutions. They want to come up with the solutions that would work for I hear this all the time where parents are like, why can't we all go back to school? In Nashville, we're not back in school as a city yet. And part of what I want, they're like, the private schools are back in. Yes, in private schools, you've got a couple thousand families, all of whom who probably live on like an acre or more of housing, who drive to school. When you start to open up the doors for 80,000 students, there are so many other, you've got folks who live in closer proximity, folks who are essential workers. There's just so much additional
riding the bus to school, the school bus, the city bus.
It just changes everything for the city. And I just think, again, to the like privilege, like folks don't have to think about that. So that's not to say that we can't come up with better solutions. I just think it's hard to have the best solutions when you don't bring people to the table who can bring all the information in and then say, okay, given all this information, how do we solve for this? As opposed to like, well, let's look at what the private schools are doing and try to apply that to a city the size of Houston.
Yeah. Yeah, I think there's a very good start because it's not just one group. The kids can't do it alone. The teachers can't do it alone. Administrators can't do it alone. So even if like the communication from my student, let's say I share it with our teachers and share it with our administration, and then we should, it gets shared on up the line. Either way, someone is going to halt it and say, but we have to meet these metrics. We have to teach to these standards. We have to still be prepared for these exams. So somewhere it's going to get ignored unless we start bringing people from all different areas together.
One of the challenges I see is even when people have the information or you have the right people at the table, the capacity for people to do anything with that information is really hard. And so I just think that that's one of the challenges of education, which is we have put so much pressure and so many things we've pushed into schools. So for example, when schools closed in March, a lot of private schools, all right, kids, you've got your computer, go home. We're going to do virtual learning from 8 a.m. to 3 p.m. A lot of the higher poverty districts in the country were thinking about, okay, how are we going to get food to kids who need food? So, one could argue, like, should schools be the primary distributor of food? Maybe, but it's like, okay, but then that means like the level of complexity we've put on to when just the education enough is like a lot. As we know, private schools they both are getting the tuition plus they raise money on top of it. So typically private schools are probably spending 3 to 4x per individual student that a public school is for kids who are already coming in with some level of opportunity and privilege. So I say that to say in terms of like, how do we get to a better place? I really do think we have to like not only bring different people to the table, but then have those people walk out and say, we are not going to put all of this on our public schools anymore. We're going to take some of that work off and hey, city, who's going to take care of making sure that kids are fed? Does not need to all go on to the school and school district.
2020 has challenged us to rethink the way that we deliver community services, whether it be in the areas of education, food security, mental health care, or policing.
I've had so many ahas being at home, watching my kids learn, and I don't know that what I'm thinking or experiencing as a parent is going to necessarily go anywhere. But part of what I think is like, oh, it's interesting. My kids are kind of done, but with school between 12 and 1:30. And then they kind of go, as my son said, when we were in regular school, we got to spend more time with our friends. Now we get to spend more time with our family. But they can kind of go, and so. But I'm like, why are we keeping all the kids in school from 8 to 3:30? Like, there are some kids who could probably leave at 1. Create some additional time for kids who need additional kind of one-on-one support and resources. Like, we could really think differently about how we are setting ourselves up. My worry is we're not going to necessarily use this time during this COVID pandemic to really learn some lessons and apply what we can. Some other things that I've seen, for example, is there are, now that we're using virtual learning, I had a friend who lives in the district. Her 8th grader was going to take algebra over the summer, but that school only had, they're going to have to go in person, she was going to have to take algebra with kids who had failed algebra during the summer. So she was going to basically be an 8th grader who was advanced, was going to be taking algebra with kids who had failed algebra the first time. Once they had to shut down and go all virtual, they were able to pull all the kids from across the district who were in 8th grade who were going to take algebra together online on a computer. And I heard about that in some other districts where they were now able to give kids more advanced classes because they could go online and do it virtually. Those are some things I think, to your point about using the 21st century technology and thinking about things differently, like, we don't all need to be in the same school building. We don't have to require from teachers all the same things. We require our teachers now to be great planners, great managers of culture, great content experts. Like, what if you could have people who really, the Khan Academy shows that you can kind of bring together someone who really knows how to teach it, the concept, and then there are other people who are really good at leading culturally. But I haven't seen any kind of well, actually, that's not true. When you have these conversations with people who are like rethinking education, I have historically mostly seen it be white men coming together and having these, like, let's reimagine education, like these philanthropists pay all these people to come together, and then you look at it and it's like, it's a lot of white men sitting around talking about how we're going to rethink education. So yeah.
Malene, any thoughts from you in terms of lessons learned and steps from COVID that we may be able to incorporate going forward?
Yeah, I think definitely agree with Shani's point about the length of the school day. We have usually the school day is usually 7:30 in the morning until 4:15 in the afternoon, an extremely long school day. Well, with COVID, we start at 8 a.m. and end at 3 p.m. That is just leaves, like Shani said, even though it's not the 8 to 1 or 2, but it still gives us so much more time. Like, we are not missing any instructional time. We're like, what were we doing? Why have we been in school all this time? Because we still have advisory that we're able to do social emotional learning with our students every morning for 30 minutes. The classes are 80 minutes long. We're doing block scheduling. But we have learned to become just much more creative in the ways that we teach our students. Virtual learning has required us to become more creative and show like different ways that they can learn using different forms of technology. Um, so me, for example, I teach a leadership class also, and I have guest speakers that come in on Tuesday. Usually they come in person, but because of COVID, no one's coming in person. We're doing it all virtually. But I get to have guest speakers from all over the world now. So, like, this week, my guest speaker is one of my line sisters. She's a judge in Ohio. She's going to be our guest speaker, which would not have been able to, we probably would not have even thought about doing it this way had it not been for being forced to find a better way to do it. So in some places we could say, well, we're just not going to have the guest speaker series at all this year. No, we're going to have it, and we're going to make it even better than it ever was before. So I think there are definitely things that we can continue to do even once COVID ends and we're able to, have in-person things like this, like guest speakers and things like that. Just opening our minds to different ways of doing things has been something that is positive that has come out of COVID.
And I know for my kids' school, actually, we had our largest parent-teacher family meeting that we've ever had, because parents, getting into the school was no longer the barrier. They just had to get on the Zoom. And so, whereas typically we have like 15 or 20 who come, this one had like 70 or 80 people.
Oh, wow. You both have some background and experience with charter schools, and there's a sense out there that charter schools and charter magnet schools now are tending to essentially just suck all the talent out of some of the neighborhoods in the public schools.
As a teacher I did not teach in a charter school. I taught in a zoned middle school in Houston that was zoned into the lowest performing high school in the city. And this has been something that's been said for a while. And transparently, I get so sad for my students. Like, are you saying like the 150 students who I taught in my zone school were not talented students? Because they were incredibly talented students. I had students in there who did math better than I knew math, even though I was a math teacher. I had students who like showed up every day And part of what they were missing was a functional school that had expectations of them.
I work in Sunnyside in temporary modular buildings. I've been in these modular buildings for 10 years. The feeder pattern is Worthing, Yates, Madison, Jones, Sterling. All 5 of those schools have brand new buildings. They absolutely deserve those buildings. I'm not taking anything away from the buildings because I think they should have gotten those buildings years ago. But when you look at what we as a public charter school are able to get versus what the public, like the outright public schools can get due to bonds and fundraising that they're able to do, that we are not able to get that same sort of funding. So there are differences in funding there and just the funding stream and how that works. Yes, there's different. When you walk into my school building, I do not think you'll say this is an amazing charter school based on our facilities alone. Now we are doing amazing things inside of our little modular portables. Uh, Give an example. We had teachers there, like from the neighborhood. I think they were from Worthing. They were touring our school, and they were amazed at the time our students had to wear ties to school every day, button-up shirts and ties to school every day. That was their uniform. The teachers from Worthing were amazed. They were like, "How do y'all get them to do this?" We're like, "Well, it's the expectation." To Shani's point, like we lower the expectation for a lot of community schools. For what reason? I don't know why we do that to our students, because they are talented. They don't have access to a lot of things. So because they don't have access, does that mean that we hold them to lower standards? I think we're doing a disservice to our students and to our community by holding them to lower standards for whatever reason.
Schools, parents, and administrators are wrestling with the possibility that many schools in some areas of the country will return to mostly virtual learning in the spring of 2021. The spread of COVID-19 has intensified, with 25% of all U.S. positive cases having occurred during the first 3 weeks of November 2020. Shani picks up.
It's so interesting. A lot of times when when zone schools are kind of trying to like make meaning of what they have to deal with, I think they look at charter schools. But what's so interesting is I think what you just said, Olaide, is right. Like if we were to put every kid and every family into the equation and say, okay, we have a lot of families who either like they kind of take the privilege of like moving out of zone into like a school district that has like higher performing schools, or like that are perceived to be higher performing schools, or they go to private schools, or they go to magnet schools, or like us when we were in Houston, we did go to somebody's zone school, but it wasn't our zone school, like, so we went out of zone. And so then I think we can have like a more honest conversation, but I don't think like I think charter schools are like kind of probably the most similar in terms of, wrestling, or at least in a place like Houston or other places. I think they're probably like more dealing with similar challenges, but that seems to be where folks go in terms of like who's taking the kids. When really it's like it's this whole bigger system. Like we don't say like, oh, families are moving out to Pearland, or families are moving into Sci-Fair, or I mean, like that's where I more saw my kids moving to than charters, was going out to the suburbs where they thought that they would get a different education. Then we can have a really good conversation, and I think we could probably have a more honest conversation about that. But I think for some reason that doesn't seem to be kind of all that we don't put all those parts and pieces in there.
And what Kip has always said is Kip wants to get to the place where it's not needed. Like if the public school system is educating our students the way they deserve to be educated, then there's no reason to have the charter school. You know what I mean? I was about to say, let me say, that's not to say that public schools aren't working their butts off and that there's very talented teachers, administrators in the public schools. But by and large, a lot of our students our school system is failing our students.
Well, I think what's going to be hard and we haven't started having this conversation as a country, but what we're seeing now, I think, as a country in a lot of urban school districts, is there are a lot of parents who are out, at least for this year. But I think there's going to be some percentage of them that aren't coming back. There was an interesting article in the New York Times that were parents, Black parents whose kids were in predominantly white schools, who actually their kids didn't want to go back to in-person learning because they didn't want to deal with the racism. Now that's a whole different conversation. But I think
My son is that my son is that kid. He does not want to go back because of the racial political environment and how conservative and white his school is.
So I just think there are a lot of interesting things that we're going to need to think about for education once we have the opportunity to go back to normal. I think we need to kind of think about what is going to be normal and what do parents want to do.
And what's best for the kids.
With all the challenges facing public education in 2020 and beyond, is there a ray of hope that Shani can point to in the Biden administration?
With this new administration is we do have people who I think believe in public education, whereas I think part of the past 4 years has been dealing with people who didn't particularly care about people who aren't like them and also didn't care about public education. I think about COVID and I think about education. One of the things I expect to see with Joe Biden is I expect to see him trying to have conversations with the teachers unions, because one of the reasons why a lot of urban school districts aren't able to go back to school is because teachers don't feel comfortable or safe going back to school. And unless you have the people who negotiate some of that feeling at least comfortable or better about it, it's not going to happen. And so Betsy DeVos can pretend that the unions don't exist, but they exist and they're powerful. So she needs to be figuring out how is she going to get them alive. If they wanted to reopen schools, this current administration, you can't do it without having conversations and building a relationship with the teachers union. And I think that's something Joe Biden would probably do differently, which is he knows that an important part of reopening schools is going to be having teachers feeling comfortable and confident going back. The teachers union is that they are the biggest spokespeople for teachers. And so those are just a couple of thoughts about the administration and what some policy changes are that we might see that would be different. And why, even though Betsy DeVos might be for charters, I think also you can't be for charters and not be for especially, studies show in this country that Black and Latino families do disproportionately support charter schools. And a lot of the charter schools, particularly in big cities, disproportionately serve Black and Latino parents. But if at a policy level, the administration is making policies that don't support Black people, immigrant families, all of that stuff, then you can't really care about their schools if you don't care about the people that are in them. And so I think that was also the disconnect for a lot of people who might support charter schools but not support kind of how this administration thought about education.
Even with the hope of a new vision for education on the national level, Malene reminds us that millions of students may never recover from the impact of 2020.
They have disengaged. A lot of students have disengaged. The percentage of our students who feel like that, who are completely disenfranchised with just life right now. So school is not it's not a priority for them at all. We're going to have a lot of work to do educationally just to fix this COVID period. The whole grade level they just missed out on. Are they going to even want to come back at that point? Especially high school kids.
I asked Malene and Shani to share some pointers on how parents, grandparents, and everyday citizens could become part of the solution to our challenges in public education. And they shared a few pointers, including 1, engage with teachers and administrators at your child's school. A second point was to attend board meetings, which are always open to the public. And then the third option, which requires maybe a little bit more courage, is consider running to be a member of the school board.
And the hard part is though, we have with my son's school, we were pushing the conversation. We were really, really active and involved during the summertime because we had more time then. It was summertime. Now that we're back in school, we have gotten busy. The follow-up is not as frequent. So it's really tough to continue to live your life in your lane, whatever you're doing, and advocate for your child's school and advocate for the neighborhood school. So we really just have to make it a priority. I mean, I say all that to say it is tough and challenging to figure out how best to get involved. The best thing to do is take some kind of step, whether it's at the board level, whether it's just talking to your child's teacher, because that doesn't happen all the time. So just being involved and engaged with your child's school, because often it's only a handful of parents who we're consistently hearing from. So then we just put those in their own little bucket. But if more parents really shared how they were feeling and what their school system, the educational system is doing for them or what it's not doing, just more voices, even starting small, would be really, really helpful.
This conversation really helped me to rethink a lot of what I thought I knew about public education, and it gave me a greater appreciation for the work that education professionals like Malene, Shani, and so many of my friends have put in during this pandemic.
Shani, how can people connect with you, learn more about POSSIP, learn more about what it is that you're doing?
Yep, you can visit us at possip.com, POSSIP.com. You can also email me, Shani, SHANI, at possip.com, and then follow us on social media. We're on Twitter, we're on LinkedIn, we're on Facebook. So follow us there. We have great articles and resources for parents to kind of, because it is all about parents and schools all are working to get our kids, kind of to their best place. So, love to see you there.
Excellent. And for you, Malene, how can people reach you, connect with you? How can they do that?
They can find, I'm going to plug POSSIP first before I talk about myself, because my school, Sunnyside High School, uses POSSIP, and they have been awesome, amazing throughout COVID, but even before then, just to be able to get consistent feedback from our parents to our teachers and administrators, and it's really helped us in a lot of ways. So definitely encourage looking into POSSIP. So for me, you can go to my website, loftylife.net. That's lofty, LOFTY, life.net. And you can email me at rmdixon@loftylife.net. That's RMDIXON @loftylife.net. Counseling, webinars, coaching, anything along the mental health field, and how anything may impact your mental health. That is what I'm here for.
Again, thank you so much for your time, and we will do this again.
I would like to thank my friend Mel Gerard, an education professional with Houston ISD, for speaking with me before this conversation to give me a better sense and understanding of the issues. The song that you heard is called A Brother's Heart by me, Olaide Banks. If you'd like to hear more of my conversations or check out my music, you can visit my website. It's olaidebanks.com. That's OLAIDEBANKS.com.